There are stories that start quietly, so quietly you'd never suspect they would leave a mark on anyone. This one began in the most ordinary place on the most ordinary afternoon inside the fluorescent-lit walls of Union Heritage Bank on Springdale Street in Los Angeles. Customers stood in line, arms crossed and phones in hand, scrolling aimlessly or glancing impatiently at the slow-moving counters. The lobby hummed with that peculiar tension that only exists in spaces where time moves slower than it should and patience thins by the second. Somewhere near the middle of that line, a woman stood clutching an envelope. Her name was Evelyn Brooks. 76 years old, she wore her years with quiet grace, the gentle creases of time marking a life of discipline and decency. A retired school teacher who had raised generations of students, she had come to the bank because her numbers no longer added up. Small deductions had begun to appear on her monthly statements, fees she didn't understand but felt in her bones weren't supposed to be there. She wasn't angry. Not yet, just confused. Maybe even a little embarrassed. The envelope in her hand wasn't just paper. It was proof that something was wrong. But in a place like that, people like Evelyn were easy to overlook. She stood quietly as others sighed and shifted around her. No one asked her if she needed help. No one cared why she was there. That kind of silence is a wound that doesn't bleed, but it still hurts. At the counter, a teller named Casey Morrow moved through her queue with mechanical efficiency. She didn't make eye contact. She didn't soften her voice. To her, Evelyn's presence was just another task on a screen. Another problem to minimize, not solve. Evelyn tried to explain her concern to show her receipt, but her words were met with condescension. The tone in the room began to shift, not because anyone cared, but because they sensed weakness. And in places like this, weakness makes people uncomfortable. It didn't take long before Jason Trent, the branch manager, appeared. His posture was stiff with authority, the kind that came from years of dodging accountability. His words were colder than the air conditioning. What began as a simple inquiry was now unraveling into public humiliation. Evelyn had come seeking clarity, but found herself standing alone beneath a spotlight she never asked for. And still no one said a word. No one stood up. The same people who had been annoyed by the wait now looked away, their silence more damning than any insult. Until the door opened. That's when everything changed. A man in a black t-shirt stepped into the room, ordinary at first glance, but carrying something in his presence that didn't belong to the world of long lines and late fees. No one knew it yet, but justice had just walked through the front door. And this bank, this tired building on a street most people forget, was about to become the setting for a reckoning no one saw coming. The late afternoon sun pressed through the tinted windows of Union Heritage Bank, casting faint amber streaks across the sterile tile floor. Outside, traffic crawled along Springdale Street in its usual rhythm of brake lights and distant sirens. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with impatience. Customers lined the lobby, wall to wall, some tapping feet, others checking their phones as time slipped past them in slow, measured beats. The sharp scent of printer toner mixed with the faint aroma of overworked air conditioning. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, their flicker almost imperceptible but constant, like the low-grade stress that filled the room. It was the kind of day that felt like it would never end. Behind the counter, the staff moved with robotic urgency, their eyes rarely lifting from the screens in front of them. Every movement was efficient but hollow-shaped more by routine than intention. The line inched forward. No one spoke unless they had to. Toward the center of the room stood Evelyn Brooks, her posture upright but gentle, her presence quiet yet dignified. She held a simple envelope in her hands, worn at the corners, and folded neatly, containing bank statements, handwritten notes, and a growing sense of unease. She had reviewed those papers a dozen times before coming in, trying to understand why her balance was no longer what it should have been. This wasn't supposed to be difficult. She had come only to ask a question. But even as she waited, something about the energy in the room made her feel smaller. She wasn't dressed to impress. She wasn't loud or demanding. She simply waited as she always had, believing that patience and politeness were still enough in a world that rarely rewarded either. That belief was about to be tested. Evelyn Brooks had never been the kind of person to make a scene. She spent her life in classrooms, guiding young minds with a steady hand and a patient heart. Decades of teaching left their mark in the way she carried herself, quietly resilient, respectful to a fault. Retirement had brought her a slower rhythm, one measured in morning walks, library visits, and carefully budgeted pension checks. She didn't live extravagantly, but she lived with dignity. And today she had come to the bank with a simple goal to understand. Behind the counter, Casey Morrow barely noticed her. Fresh out of college, Casey had fallen into the role of bank teller with the kind of indifference that came from seeing people as numbers. She moved briskly, kept her tone flat, and measured her success by how quickly she could close each transaction. Evelyn didn't register as important. She wasn't dressed in business attire. She didn't carry a briefcase. She didn't command attention. So Casey offered her none. From his glass-walled office, Jason Trent watched the room like a man convinced of his own importance. As the branch manager, he had crafted an image of professionalism that masked a deep-rooted disdain for anything that disrupted his control. To him, Evelyn was a delay, a complication, a customer who didn't know how to navigate the system. He preferred those who didn't ask questions, the ones who nodded, signed, and left. When Evelyn stepped forward, he noticed, but only enough to file her under trouble. At that moment, no one in the bank knew what was coming. Not Casey with her scripted responses, not Jason with his forced authority, and not Evelyn, who carried more strength in her silence than anyone had yet realized. But someone else was about to walk in and change everything. When Evelyn finally reached the front of the line, her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from age and the weight of frustration she had tried to keep at bay. She placed her envelope on the counter with care, organizing the papers so they were easy to follow. The numbers didn't lie. Over the past 2 months, her account had been charged a series of fees she had never seen before. Small, inconsistent deductions labeled with vague descriptions. They weren't large individually, but together they had quietly siphoned off enough to disrupt her delicate financial balance. Casey glanced at the documents without much interest. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, typing half-heartedly, her eyes barely scanning the records. She leaned into a tone she had used many times before, one that placed blame without acknowledgement, one that suggested the customer simply didn't understand the rules. Evelyn listened carefully, trying to make sense of the explanation, but something about the tone made her feel dismissed. Not once did Casey look her in the eye. Not once did she speak as though Evelyn's concern had merit. The exchange dragged on, growing colder with every passing moment. Casey's impatience became more visible, the clipped movements, the sighs between keystrokes, the subtle shift in posture meant to signal inconvenience. Around them, the room buzzed with disinterest. Customers in line looked away as if her problem didn't exist. The silence of the crowd stung more than any words. Evelyn pressed forward gently, pointing to a date circled in pen, a charge she knew hadn't appeared in any prior years. But the response she received wasn't clarity, it was condescension. The policies were cited, the system was blamed. Her history as a long-time customer meant nothing. The shame came slowly at first, then all at once. The feeling of being talked down to. The realization that her years of loyalty were invisible to the very institution she had trusted. Her voice, steady at the beginning, began to falter. Not from weakness, but from the weight of being unheard. And then from the corner of her eye, she noticed movement. A figure stepping closer. She didn't know it yet, but she wasn't going to stand alone much longer. The moment she had feared would break her was about to reveal something else entirely, a strength hidden in the most unexpected places. Jason Trent had been watching the exchange unfold from behind the safety of his office window. His arms were crossed tightly over his chest, his face a portrait of practiced indifference. To him, Evelyn's presence at the counter was nothing more than a familiar inconvenience. Another elderly customer confused by the complexities of modern banking, likely unwilling to accept that times had changed. He had seen it before. In his mind, it never ended in anything more than wasted minutes. When he finally stepped out into the lobby, he did so with calculated timing. The line had grown restless and the energy around the counter was beginning to shift. He approached with a calm, rehearsed expression, a blend of authority and disinterest that came from years of maintaining control through posture alone. The weight of his title followed him like a badge. Evelyn turned to him with quiet hope, expecting resolution. What she received was something else entirely. Jason's presence didn't diffuse the tension. It amplified it. His words, though measured, were coated in dismissal. He spoke not to clarify, but to shut down. His gestures were deliberate, leaning slightly forward, projecting confidence, raising his voice just enough so the surrounding customers could hear. Evelyn's confusion was turned into a public spectacle framed as ignorance. Her questions were reduced to noise. Her dignity was chipped away by corporate phrasing and empty policies. To those watching, it may have seemed like a manager doing his job, but to Evelyn, it felt like erasure. Her loyalty, her record, her decades of responsible banking, none of it mattered. The final blow wasn't loud or angry. It was quiet, polished, and cruel. A few people in line shifted uncomfortably, but no one said anything. The silence was permission. Evelyn stood still, her eyes downcast, the envelope still in her hand. She had not come to fight. She had come to be heard. But now she felt smaller than ever. Alone at the counter beneath the cold gaze of policy and power, she braced herself for the quiet exit she had not expected but already began to accept. Until a new presence entered the room, and with it, everything began to change. The entrance door opened with a soft chime that barely registered in the noise of the bank's impatient murmur. A man stepped inside, unassuming in jeans, a fitted black t-shirt, and a well-worn baseball cap pulled low over his brow. He looked like any other customer, casual, composed, almost forgettable. And yet something about him disrupted the air the moment he crossed the threshold. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His posture said enough. It wasn't arrogance, it was clarity. The kind that follows people who have lived through more than they show. He moved with quiet authority, not toward the line, but toward the counter where Evelyn Brooks still stood, small, still, and enduring under the fluorescent lights and dismissive gazes. Jason Trent turned, already annoyed by the disruption. But as his eyes met the newcomers, something in his expression shifted. There was a flicker, a crack in the composed veneer. A second passed, then another, and recognition set in. A man known not for banking, but for the screens that filled theaters and living rooms. The kind of man who rarely needed to raise his voice to shift an entire room's energy. Marcus Vale had walked into the room like a question no one was prepared to answer. The customers fell silent. Phones were lowered. Conversations paused. Casey Morrow's fingers froze above the keyboard. No one knew exactly why they were holding their breath, only that they were. Evelyn turned slightly, her eyes rising to meet his. Confusion touched her face first, then something else. She didn't recognize him as a celebrity. She didn't need to. What she recognized was the look in his eyes. Not pity, not condescension, but respect. Someone had finally seen her. Marcus didn't move quickly. He didn't make a scene. He simply stepped forward, surveyed the situation, and read everything that needed to be read in seconds. The papers in Evelyn's hands, the frozen discomfort on Casey's face, the tightness in Jason's jaw. Where others had ignored, Marcus noticed. Where others had passed judgment, he paused. And in that pause, the power dynamic of the entire room shifted. The man who had once been the spectacle now became the standard. The one who entered last was now the one everyone looked toward. Jason tried to recover his footing, but the presence in front of him wasn't something he could outmaneuver. It wasn't just celebrity. It was principle carried like weight on the shoulders of someone who had seen too much to stay silent. The silence didn't last long. A few heads turned. A phone camera lifted quietly into place. Whispers traveled across the lobby like sparks. The system that had seemed so rigid just moments before was starting to creak. And somewhere behind that moment of stillness, Evelyn felt something unfamiliar rising within her vindication. Not because someone had come to save her, but because someone had finally chosen to stand beside her. And that made all the difference. Marcus Vale didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The stillness that followed his arrival spoke louder than any confrontation. Without fanfare, he reached for the envelope in Evelyn's hand, lifting it gently, like one would handle something fragile but important. His movements were deliberate, his presence centered. He flipped through the papers with a calm that belied the weight of the moment. Each line item told a story. Each deduction chipped away at trust. But Marcus didn't just see numbers, he saw patterns. Jason Trent hovered nearby his stance, no longer confident but cautious. His eyes followed Marcus's every movement, calculating risks, seeking a path out. But there was no script for what was unfolding. Not anymore. The rules of hierarchy had shifted the moment someone decided to care. Marcus motioned toward the nearest terminal. The young teller, still stunned, hesitated before reluctantly accessing Evelyn's account. The screen blinked to life, illuminating rows of transaction history. Marcus leaned in, studying the timeline. The fees were there, small, frequent, unannounced. They hadn't been applied randomly. They followed a change, quiet and internal, implemented just weeks prior. It wasn't just an oversight, it was systemic. Jason attempted to explain. His words lacked the sharpness they once carried. He referenced policy. He alluded to corporate rules. But Marcus was already ahead of him. With one hand resting on the counter, he turned slightly toward the room, knowing others were watching. This wasn't just about Evelyn anymore. It was about every name hidden behind those fees. Every person who had been too tired, too busy, or too uncertain to push back. Behind Marcus, phones were being raised again. Silent cameras recorded truth in real time. No one in the room looked away now. They were witnesses. As Marcus pointed to the date when the deductions began, the pattern became undeniable. The fees had surged across accounts like Evelyn's, long-standing, modest, reliable. The kind of accounts that wouldn't trigger alerts or angry calls. They had been selected intentionally or not because they were vulnerable. Jason's face turned pale. The narrative he had built of customer ignorance and inflexible systems was collapsing. And standing across from him wasn't just a man with fame. It was a man who wouldn't let it go. The weight of silence shifted into something heavier: expectation. Marcus didn't accuse, he revealed. He gave the bank a chance to respond, but without offering them the chance to escape. The facts were there. The people were watching. The decision now rested in Jason's hands. For the first time that afternoon, Evelyn didn't feel out of place. She wasn't the confused woman at the counter anymore. She was the reason truth was being uncovered. The envelope she brought, once ignored, had become evidence, and the system that once dismissed her was now on trial. Marcus Vale stood still, his frame steady as he shifted his focus from the glowing monitor to the faces around the room. He wasn't grandstanding. He wasn't performing. He was inviting. One simple gesture, a slow lift of the papers in his hand, was enough to say everything that needed saying. He didn't ask for attention. He already had it. He didn't demand action. He inspired it. For a brief moment, the bank was silent again. Not the silence of fear or dismissal, but the kind that comes when people are waiting to see if they're the only one. The kind that breaks only when someone dares to go first. A man near the back, still wearing a high-visibility work shirt, raised his hand. Hesitant, but deliberate. Then a woman with a baby on her hip looked down at her phone and slowly nodded, lifting her hand as well. Next, an elderly couple exchanged glances before following suit. What began as a trickle became a wave. One by one, hands rose across the room. Young and old men and women, faces once indifferent, were now alert, connected by a shared experience none of them had spoken of until now. Marcus scanned the room with a calm intensity, his expression unchanged but charged. The implication was clear. This wasn't a one-off error. This was a pattern, a quiet design, a systemic oversight, or worse, made invisible by its scale and the trust it betrayed. Jason Trent stood frozen behind the counter, his mind racing as his authority crumbled in real time. What had once been a matter between a bank and a customer was now a full-scale reckoning. Not only had the fees affected Evelyn, they had touched dozens more, and those dozens were no longer quiet. Casey Morrow, still seated at her terminal, seemed to shrink beneath the weight of the revelation. The confidence that had once armored her was gone. She looked not at the screen, but at the people finally seeing them as more than transactions. Every name she had processed was now a person with a hand raised, a voice ready, a truth unfolding. The phones came out again, but not in secrecy. They were held openly now, angled to capture not just Marcus or Evelyn, but the entire room. Screens blinked to life. Live streams began. Comments poured in. The outside world was being invited inside, and the truth had no more corners to hide in. For the first time in that sterile, fluorescent room, something real was happening. Not just a complaint, not just a correction, but a moment of collective clarity. The people who had once stood in line with heads down and eyes averted were now standing taller, not in protest, but in quiet affirmation that they too had been wronged. What had started with one envelope had turned into a movement. And now the bank wasn't just facing one woman, it was facing all of them. Jason Trent had always thrived in control. It was the one constant in his neatly tailored career structure: authority, obedience. But now, standing beneath the fluorescent lights that once reflected his command, he felt that control slipping through his fingers like sand. The faces staring back at him no longer carried the passive expressions he was used to. There was awareness in their eyes now, solidarity, and behind it all, standing still as stone, was Marcus Vale, unshaken, unmoved, unblinking. The manager tried to recover. He straightened his tie, adjusted his stance, and summoned his well-rehearsed lines. Policy, procedure, corporate directives. But each word he offered seemed to wilt in the air before it reached its destination. The room had grown immune to empty explanations. The silence that met him wasn't passive, it was decisive. The kind that signaled judgment had already been passed. Marcus didn't need to interrupt. His presence alone shifted the weight of every argument. His eyes, locked on Jason, didn't rage. They judged. Without raising his voice, without pointing fingers, he had already drawn the line between principle and pretense. And Jason, for all his years of polished deflection, found himself on the wrong side of it. Behind the counter, Casey sat stiffly, her hands folded in her lap. Now no longer typing, no longer distant. Her gaze was fixed on the monitor, the numbers on Evelyn's account glowing like accusations. She knew the charges weren't right. She had always known. But like everyone else, she had chosen silence until now. Jason turned toward her, hoping for backup, for even the smallest nod of allegiance. But Casey looked away. That single movement struck deeper than any word. For the first time in years, Jason stood truly alone. Marcus remained steady. He didn't lecture. He didn't grandstand. Instead, he allowed the room to speak for itself. The raised hands, the silent stares, the lifted phones. They were louder than any protest. Jason's voice, once a tool of command, was now brittle and unsure. Every sentence he uttered seemed to chip away at the wall he'd built around his authority. Then came the final crack. One of the customers, silent until now, stepped forward, their phone held high. A screen glowed with a live stream already underway, comments racing down like a waterfall of accountability. Jason's name was there. So was the name of the branch, his title, his actions. Captured, streamed, shared. The shift was complete. This wasn't a bank lobby anymore. It was a courtroom, and the jury was everywhere. Jason looked at Marcus one last time. The man hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, but had unraveled a system with presence alone. Control no longer lived behind the counter. It stood across from it, arms crossed, eyes clear, truth in hand. And for the first time in his career, Jason Trent felt the full weight of power he couldn't silence. The atmosphere inside Union Heritage Bank no longer resembled the place it had been an hour earlier. The quiet hum of machinery and low murmurs had been replaced by the thick electric stillness that comes just before a verdict. The power structure had inverted. Customers who once stood silently now formed an unspoken wall of accountability. Staff who had followed instructions without question now glanced at each other with uncertainty. And Jason Trent, once the self-assured gatekeeper of order, stood at the center of a storm of his own making. Marcus Vale remained unwavering. His arms were folded across his chest, not in defiance, but in judgment. He didn't pace. He didn't speak. He allowed the silence to press in like gravity. The pressure didn't come from shouting, it came from truth. And now that truth had been made visible to everyone in the room and beyond, the camera phones had not gone down. They were broadcasting, sharing, amplifying. Jason tried to reclaim ground. His words, once tools of control, now landed like brittle leaves. He muttered something to Casey. Her response was immediate and unspoken. Her hands moved across the keyboard, initiating the reversal process without fanfare or hesitation. The screen filled with lines of digital redress. One by one, the erroneous fees vanished undone by the very system that had once justified them. There was no applause, no celebration, just a collective exhale, a slow release of tension from every person who had watched the scene unfold and wondered what justice might look like in real time. But it wasn't finished. Marcus didn't leave. He stood his ground, watching the process with the calm patience of someone who understood that systems don't change unless someone stays to witness their repair. Jason hesitated. His next move wasn't procedural, it was personal. He looked at Evelyn, who had remained by the counter the entire time, quiet but resolute. No longer invisible, no longer isolated. And then the moment arrived, the apology. It didn't come naturally. It was clumsy, forced, almost mechanical. But it came. Not because Jason suddenly understood, but because the room required it. Because the cameras required it. Because the truth had left him with no other option. Marcus gave one final nod, not of approval, but of acknowledgement. The kind that signaled the balance had been restored, if only temporarily. The kind that said this was the bare minimum. Evelyn didn't respond with triumph. She didn't gloat. She simply stood a little straighter, her envelope still in hand, her expression soft but firm. She hadn't come seeking revenge. She had come seeking fairness. And now, for the first time in a long while, she had found it. The bank was no longer just a building filled with numbers and names. It had become a place where something rare had occurred, a reversal not just of fees, but of power. And the story was no longer private. It was public, permanent, and spreading. The reversal had been executed, but the air inside the bank still carried the weight of unfinished business. Screens showed corrected balances. Customers, once passive observers, stood grounded in silent validation. And yet a single thread remained loose, one that Marcus Vale was not prepared to leave dangling. He remained at the center of the room, eyes steady, arms folded, waiting not for numbers to change, but for something deeper. Correction was one thing. Accountability was another. The apology Jason had offered had passed over the moment like a whisper, hollow and transactional. It had been said, but not felt. It had restored protocol, but not respect. And Marcus knew that without a final reckoning, the system would heal without ever learning. The manager shifted uncomfortably, his face pale, his voice caught somewhere between shame and resistance. He looked to Casey, then to the watching crowd. The pressure was no longer subtle. It pulsed from every corner of the room. It echoed through every phone, still recording every customer, still watching every silent second that passed without resolution. Marcus didn't speak, but his presence alone demanded one final act, the one that mattered most. A true apology. Jason's defenses, already thin, collapsed under the collective weight. His jaw tightened, his shoulders slumped, and he turned toward Evelyn. She hadn't asked for any of this. She hadn't raised her voice or stirred a crowd. She had simply stood her ground, and that quiet strength, seen now by an entire room, left no room for anything but honesty. This time, when Jason bowed his head, it wasn't scripted. His words, quiet, hesitant, fractured, carried the raw discomfort of a man who had been stripped of pretense. He acknowledged the disrespect. He recognized her loyalty. He named the harm done. And though it wouldn't undo the past, it marked something rare, a moment where power admitted it had failed. Evelyn didn't respond right away. She didn't need to. Her presence, like Marcus's, had already spoken volumes. The envelope in her hand was no longer just evidence. It was a symbol of how dignity could outlast indifference. She nodded once, gracious, not triumphant, and the room exhaled with her. Marcus gave one last look around the lobby. Not a dramatic farewell, not a final statement. Just a simple, silent sweep of the eyes that made it clear this wasn't about spectacle. It was about standards. He adjusted his cap, turned, and walked out, his work done. The doors closed behind him, but the moment stayed. Jason stood motionless. The staff remained quiet. And Evelyn, now centered in a space that once tried to erase her, finally felt what had long been denied: validation. Outside, the city moved as usual, but inside that bank something had shifted. Not just policy, not just money, but memory. The kind that lingers. The kind that changes things. The aftermath arrived not with headlines, but with ripples first subtle, then undeniable. Within hours, the video taken inside Union Heritage Bank began to spread. Uploaded with a simple caption and no need for embellishment, it traveled from one feed to the next, finding momentum not through outrage but recognition. What people saw wasn't a spectacle, it was a reflection. A moment so familiar, so quietly infuriating that it resonated in homes, offices, and conversations far beyond Springdale Street. Within 24 hours, the video reached local news, then national outlets. Analysts dissected every second, commentators praised the restraint and clarity of Marcus Vail's actions, and the public responded with a rare unanimity. They weren't just reacting to injustice. They were reacting to the way it had been answered with composure, presence, and moral clarity. What unfolded in that quiet bank lobby had touched something deeper. It wasn't about celebrity, it was about decency. The corporate office of Union Heritage Bank issued a formal statement by the end of the week. They called for an internal review of all recent account policy changes. They pledged transparency. But their most visible action came swiftly. Jason Trent was removed from his position. The language was measured, citing a failure to uphold customer service standards and a breach of ethical responsibility. But the subtext was clear. The institution had been publicly exposed, and accountability was the only remaining currency. Casey Morrow was placed under review. After providing a full account of internal practices and confirming that she and others had been directed to downplay fee inquiries, she was retained. A note followed from Human Resources promising employee retraining and new oversight. The changes were real, but reactive. Born not from conscience, but from consequence. For Evelyn Brooks, the days that followed were both surreal and quiet. She returned to her routine tea at the kitchen table, walks to the library, a small garden she tended with the patience of someone who'd seen decades pass. But the world had changed around her, even if her own remained modest. Letters began to arrive. Messages from strangers. Thank yous. Handwritten notes from young people who said they saw their grandmothers in her. From others who said they finally had the courage to ask questions at their own banks. And then one morning, an envelope arrived, unmarked but personal. Inside was a small note in clean, familiar handwriting. A few lines of quiet affirmation. Alongside it, a signed poster from an upcoming film and a simple invitation to attend its premiere not as a guest of honor, but as a reminder that dignity deserves celebration too. Evelyn smiled not because of the attention, but because something deeper had settled. She had stood her ground, and someone had stood with her. In a world where people were often dismissed for being too quiet, too old, or too invisible, she had become something unshakable. A witness, a spark, a reminder. And that, more than anything, was enough.